Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining this learning experience brought to you by Harness. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. Before we dive into things, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to review with everyone. First of all, we are recording our session today. So if you miss any of our conversation, if you'd like to watch again at a later time, or if you'd like to share this with the rest of your team, we will be sending you the on-demand recording via email shortly after we conclude this live session today. Now, if you'd like to get involved, there are a couple of ways to do so. Your first option is to use the chat tab on the right side of your screen. And when you find that chat tab, I'd like you to let us know from where in the world you're joining from today. If you have specific questions, we do want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab on the right side of that chat section. We'll be reserving some time at the end of our conversation today to address questions, so be sure to send those in and we'll address as many as we can. Additionally, if you jump over to the handout section, you'll find a white paper that is relevant to our topic today, as well as a link to the Harness website, so go ahead and check those out for us. And before we close things out, or rather, thank you in advance for your questions and chats today, because those two will make you eligible for our $50 Amazon gift card giveaway. So please send in your chats, your questions, and more to come on our post-webinar survey at the end of our session today. So to dive right into our topic, we are going to discuss the 5 tenets of effective DevSecOps. And I'm joined today by Sean Roth, Director of Solutions Marketing for DevSecOps at Harness. So Sean, thank you so much for joining us here on Techstrong Learning. I'll pass the mic on over to you and let you take over.
All right, thanks so much, Cody. So welcome everyone. As Cody mentioned, my name is Sean Roth and I'm responsible for go-to-market around our DevSecOps solutions. So effectively, Harness is a software delivery platform. We have several modules that are focused on shift-left security and software supply chain assurance, essentially how we build more secure applications faster. And so today's discussion really pulls in folks from DevOps functions, software developers, and also application security folks. I think this is a topic that has come up and it is increasingly talked about, especially in the last few years, fairly nascent. And it's always difficult to have a discussion about DevSecOps, with a diverse group of folks in the room. Everybody is focused on the same goal of making their software more secure and doing it in a way that works for developers and kind of maintaining their productivity and speed. But everybody's got sort of from a unique vantage point, and how all of those initiatives come together. That's really the focus of our discussion today. So what I'm going to provide through that discussion are really just kind of some guiding principles around, how do you come together and build a DevSecOps framework that works for your organization? So let's dive right in. So just setting a little context, and maybe some of this is familiar for those of you that are looking at the trends around how modern applications today are built. If you look at software as arguably one of the most under-addressed attack surfaces in the enterprise, you see that an increasing amount of vulnerabilities in software are introduced through the use of open source components. And that kind of makes sense. So software being built as kind of a collection of all of these more composable pieces, especially like in microservices architectures and containers, and software development itself is highly distributed and much more complex. And so, making that work and increasing the speed of building and deploying applications, really there's a lot of use of open source components and libraries and so forth. And so this has become a much more prevalent attack vector from a security perspective. And so, Gartner estimates that in the next year and a bit, about 45% of organizations will have experienced some kind of attack on their software supply chain. So that's somewhat alarming. This is growing in prominence as an attack vector, and again, all the more reason to figure out, how do you go about better integrating security throughout the software development lifecycle. When we talk about supply chain, what really does that mean? It's probably fair to say, everybody is like intimately familiar with how supply chains work, like perhaps in a manufacturing context, but software is kind of the same thing. You have to look at all of the code, not only the code that you write yourself, but other components, people, systems, and processes that ultimately contribute to developing and delivering any software artifact. And so, as I mentioned, this comes from both within and beyond your organization. So a lot of moving parts. And as you look at this through the lens of security, that is very difficult to make more secure. And again, alluding to what I had mentioned before about the increasing use of open source components in modern applications. And statistically, there's a rising cost to any supply chain attack here. And so the estimate here on, from Juniper research shows that, about $81 billion in cost to businesses globally by 2026, and that's not too far away. And so the stakes are high. There's never been greater pressure on organizations to figure out ways to secure their applications and their software supply chains. You're likely familiar with some of these events. These were high-profile breaches that we've seen play out in the last several years, and each of them involved some kind of attack or compromise on part of the software supply chain. Log4j was a really good example of that. So, open source logging framework, and it just so happened that there was some vulnerable aspect of their communications functionality, which ultimately allowed an attacker to introduce malware through logs. And so as that played out, that impacted pretty much every user of Log4j, which goes into a lot of different types of applications at a pretty high cost. And so, just going about mitigating something like that, there's a huge force multiplier. If you're an attacker, you compromise a widely used open source component. No wonder the blast radius, so to speak, is very large. So there's increasing regulatory pressure, and again, for organizations perhaps like yours that are figuring out ways to better introduce security at every point in the software development lifecycle, there's mounting security and compliance pressure here, regulatory pressure. We'll talk about some of the regulations that that have been newly introduced and come into play. So again, discussions around DevSecOps. So ultimately, how do I get my software developers, my security teams, and then IT operations, effectively DevOps here, to work together to adopt new tools and technologies and put together processes where security is ultimately a shared responsibility through these functions throughout the entire IT lifecycle. So that, it's no small feat to be able to do that. Every organization is different. The software they produce is designed and architected differently. And so, are there really any, is there a playbook for getting DevSecOps right? It's a really difficult thing to do. We talked about how software today is being built and deployed. And so, this in itself is complex. There's a lot at stake. It's fast paced. So how do you get security on board with that in a way that doesn't slow down software developers or create a bad experience for them? Because that really that will impact productivity and speed to market with new applications. At the heart of all this, DevSecOps, regardless of which function you come from, there's some cultural change that's required, and that's something that I think we all know in organizations it doesn't really change overnight. So that's really a major consideration, and it's going to be the first topic of discussion in our 5 core tenets of successful DevSecOps. And as I'm sure many of you are painfully aware, there are so many different tools and many different approaches to shift left security and software supply chain security, but there are a few de facto standards. Again, I think insofar as my discussions with people out there in the field from DevOps and from security teams, everybody has a very different idea of how this can all come together. And this is a fairly nascent practice. So, it's kind of interesting to see what ultimately is going to work. What are the best practices that are going to emerge now and in the near term. So what we've come up with here, I think many of these essentially make sense. I would say, perhaps number 1 and number 5 are pretty obvious, but, it starts with culture change. How do you establish a security-minded culture within your organization? The culture is sort of like, the shared norms and processes and really what defines how an organization works together. So, that is a key ingredient. We'll also talk about shifting security information left and not the security workload. So there's some interesting discussion there. Proper governance and guardrails, essentially want to put controls in place that make it easy to do the right things and very difficult to do the wrong things when it comes to building and deploying your applications. And fourth, we'll talk about securing the software supply chain. So looking just beyond your own source code. And the fifth one, I think it's fair to say, this is always in the headlines and the industry news, how AI is changing all of these, all of these practices within the enterprise. I mean, it's no surprise that it's used now, pretty regularly in cybersecurity. We'll talk about some of the automation and AI technologies and how they would play into making your DevSecOps framework more effective. So let's dive into the first guiding principle. We talked about culture change being a really, really tough thing to kind of institute and establish. So when security, in this particular case, you've got 3 fairly distinct functions that really need to come together and work together to make for effective DevSecOps. And that's a shared responsibility. So, it comes down to having your software engineers kind of approach their work with that, high security as a high priority, if not a major priority, the top priority in some cases when it comes to their work. Not every software developer kind of knows the ins and outs or maybe understands the full impact of how they code and how that relates to security posture. And so have internal security trainings available. Developers should adopt some kind of secure coding methodology if they're not well practiced with that. That is something that can definitely make a positive impact. You're effectively building code, and the way that comes together will introduce fewer vulnerabilities at earlier stages. And then have your security engineering teams contribute to application and environment architecture design reviews. So the earlier you involve security, the earlier you're able to uncover, potential issues or vulnerabilities. And again, it's sort of like once you, if you're going to bake a cake, it's always easier to course correct and change the outcome of what you're baking earlier in the process rather than, when it's just ready to go in the oven. You can't really go back and change it without completely starting over. maybe not the best analogy, but again, like the earlier on you can institute good practices and sort of like this shared security responsibility model, that already sets you off on a better path to producing code that is more hardened against known vulnerabilities, and also it'll save you some design cycles. So we talk about DevSecOps, the sort of like the integration of three functions working together. And so again, it comes as no surprise that you really have to work to break down any barriers between teams and just set aside kind of these siloed organizational maps and create cross-functional teams that regularly work together and are driving toward a set of common and measurable security objectives. And so I've listed 3 out here, and these again I think are pretty obvious. You just want to decrease the number of application security incidents at any stage of your pipeline. Reducing the amount of time spent on audits. Again, secure coding practices and doing some of the right things up front when it comes to security will dramatically impact the time that you spend on audits too. And you want to increase your deployment frequency. So again, like that will be a function of how well and how smoothly you're able to integrate some security practices in your build and deploy pipelines. So developers and DevOps teams should really come together to evaluate new security tools and technologies. Ultimately, the good ones are going to integrate well with the existing CI/CD platforms that are in place, or perhaps it's an entirely new platform that seamlessly integrates security functionality and controls in a way that just makes it very easy to operate together. And then, no process should have a single gatekeeper. Maybe I should clarify and say that it should have a single functional gatekeeper. Again, this is a way just to really operate better together. So we'll start getting into some discussion about like the actual process of integrating security practices throughout the software development lifecycle. Everybody these days is pretty aware of the notion of shift left security. What ultimately does that mean? Well, it essentially means that whatever you're going to do to secure your code should be done as early in the pipeline as possible. Typically what you see, and again, there's a big reason why the traditional approach to securing applications doesn't really work when it comes to modern applications and sort of like modern DevOps here. Typically what happens is that, you'll build your code and, deploy it in a test environment. And just before you get to production, you run a bunch of security scans on your code. And so the security team looks at the output of those scanners and just compiles it and sends it right back to developers. And so, and this is like, this causes a lot of problems, especially if you're up against a tight timeline to release a new application or a new version of existing application. So the developer basically gets that output and has to figure out, okay, which vulnerabilities are really the most important here? And why do I see the same vulnerability listed out several times here? Like I know that I may have one or more scanners that give me this vulnerability as a CVE that I have to fix. And so that's a huge amount of toil and work. It's certainly a big mental load for a developer who now has to drop what they're doing and then focus on this list from the security team. So that's kind of a broken model that just does not work well today. You essentially have this delayed feedback loop of information, and then you're bolting on all of these security scanners the security team compiles the output, and nothing is really fed into, or nothing is available in the platform in a way that allows for this more seamless way for developers and security engineers to work together. So the goal of shift left security, in my view, is really to shift the security information left and not the workload. So how do you do that? If you detect things earlier in the pipeline, you can certainly fix them faster. And as you can see here, what you'd want to do is run static application security tests and then software composition analysis at different stages. It really has to do with the way that you orchestrate all of these security tests. And then what you give back to the development team, again, I'm speaking from the vantage point of an application security team, is you want to provide a developer with a deduplicated and prioritized list of CVEs to address. And then in the best case, the developer has some prescriptive guidance on how they're going to remediate those vulnerabilities. So I think what works really, really well here is what the developer gets back and the information that they can act on with not a whole lot of work to go and trace those vulnerabilities back to their code and to remediate them. A big part of this too is a policy as code approach to governance. So you certainly don't want to deploy any software artifact that's vulnerable. And so you can certainly put guardrails in place. What I'm showing here, the leading policy as code approach is really based on OPA, the Open Policy Agent. And again, that's used here to, let's say you script up a policy that says, nothing with a critical or high priority vulnerability should pass through to be deployed. And so that ultimately is dependent on your scanner output. So you put these guardrails in place. Again, the idea is to just make it super easy and effortless to do the right things and really hard to do the wrong things, like deploying a vulnerable software artifact. So this is really, I think the model really works when you've got tools in place and an approach to shift left security that just allows the developer to zero in on what's really critical and remediate it without a lot of toil. So on the topic of guardrails, again, this, I can't really overstate the importance of good governance within CI/CD pipelines and the guardrails that you can put in place. And obviously that all starts with roles-based access controls. Again, like you have, so many different, there are different functions, people from your developers, DevOps, and security coming together to essentially work on the same platform. You want to ensure that there are proper usage for those accounts and they're what they have to do and what their accounts allow them to do is working for the whole process. So fine-grained RBAC is a really good way to be able to do that. Policy as code, we touched a bit on this in the description of tenet number 2 about shift left security. So again, this is a way to use the leading open source agent for authorization and policy in a way that just makes it easy for developers to control pipelines, makes it easy for security and compliance folks to enforce security checks at specific points. And again, the margin for error is dramatically reduced when you've got very strong policies in place throughout the pipelines. I think another piece of this really is the use of templates. So if you've got golden templates, again, this comes in very handy when you're running, like you may have hundreds of pipelines. You want to use a template wherever it's possible. Again, you build a golden standard, leverage that, and that's a fast path to eliminating unforced errors. So the fourth guiding principle here, again, is there's a huge focus on the source code that you're building and deploying. But again, as we talked about the software supply chain being that is the level at which I think organizations and their security teams really have to focus on. It comes down to the proliferation of open source components that are used, and how do you know exactly what it is? Do you have an understanding of what that component is, what version it is, where it comes from, who built it? Like there's the concept of provenance, which essentially means that you have full visibility into the chain of custody of a certain artifact. And you have to, with the current regulatory pressure in play, you can look at, let's say the executive order 14028 that was signed by the White House a few years ago. And essentially it was put in place to enhance the cybersecurity posture of the country. And so like a whole bunch of different mandates. And one of them was to have a software bill of materials that you as a software producing vendor could supply to your customers and users. And if you're selling into government, especially, that's going to be required. It's basically a complete listing and an account of what is in your software. But trust is really paramount. And when you're looking at today's software, which is built with all sorts of different artifacts and open source components, you really need to be able to verify chain of custody for those artifacts and sort of attest to the provenance of the ones that you're creating in-house. So one framework, the framework for that is called SALSA. So it's supply chain levels for software artifacts, and most of that is focused kind of on the on the build phase of software artifacts. But it basically is a means of establishing trust in software components. So one of the things that we offer at Harness is that for Harness CI hosted builds, we support SALSA level 3, which is the highest level of that framework, meaning that you can verify that it was built on a Harness hosted platform, and of course, like all of the the parameters that would essentially tell you that this piece of software is guaranteed tamper proof. SALSA doesn't necessarily prevent malware from being created, but it just makes it much harder to tamper with any particular software artifact. So how does all this play out within your build and deploy pipelines? Here's just kind of a layout, given a kind of a standard pipeline of what you would do here as you're building a software artifact. So once you build it, you would then generate and attest that artifact's provenance. And so using the SALSA framework, you could you basically that provenance is created, and you would sign it. You would use a key pair for that. That information again is stored with the artifact, and so as you build your container image, and that artifact is going to be used, you can also generate and attest an SBOM, a software bill of materials that shows that yes, it includes these artifacts and these dependencies, and all of that detailed machine readable information is used essentially to guarantee to ensure the integrity of the software that you're building. And then again, the governance piece comes into play here, where you don't want to deploy any artifact where there's there's just not, you don't have an SBOM for, or like you can't verify the chain of custody of it. This is essentially a very effective means, once you've got a software bill of materials and you have all the detailed information for a particular artifact. Let's say you pop open the news one day, or something shows up in your feed where there's a 0-day vulnerability that was discovered in some open source component. If you basically run your pipelines and you've addressed your supply chain security in this fashion, it'll be much easier to remediate that 0-day vulnerability. The SBOM will kind of give you, it'll help you find impacted components, and having visibility into what you've built your software with, you can go and trace it back through pipelines and through environments. And so that, this is a pretty effective methodology for being able to do that. Shift left security and orchestrating security tests throughout the pipeline. That's kind of where most people start, and that's a means of being able to find all of the known vulnerabilities in your code. This is a very effective way to, in the event of a 0-day vulnerability, being able to just remediate that as fast as possible. So we talked about being able to verify provenance and establish trust with SLSA compliance. Again, for very detailed information on the SLSA framework, you can go to SLSA, slsa.dev. And again, all of that is like, this is in the open source, and all that information is available to you, and you can have a look at the different levels. But the highest level, which is SLSA level 3, that prevents your, any cross-build contamination. It requires 2-person review of any changes, and kind of you're basically at the highest level to be able to guarantee the integrity of that artifact. So highly effective in preventing any kind of tampering. So here we get to the fifth and final piece of guidance here. Maybe it's the most obvious, given the fact that AI is front and center, and it's pretty much in every headline here that you read, and how it's being used in, throughout so many different other technologies, and the enterprise is no different for security. That's always been kind of a key component. And here, automation is your friend. Again, as an extension, or I would say part of the foundation of really good governance is just automation. And so whether it has to do with the orchestration of security tests in your pipelines, the use of templates, your governance, applying policies. Once you automate all of this, it really goes a long way to make for code that has fewer vulnerabilities, and there's a massive reduction in the margin for error there. And AI, in many cases, is now being used to offer remediation guidance. And so, that what that means for developers is that they spend less time having to figure out how to remediate a specific vulnerability, because there's a kind of prescriptive guidance that is generated alongside the description of the vulnerability that they get. And so, again, a huge advantage if your goal is to really make security workable. You have to do it in a way that really works for your developers. So in summary, the 5 core tenets here, these guiding principles, I think each of them can go pretty deep, but just to quickly recap what we discussed here, building a security-minded culture where your developers and DevOps and security engineers can collaborate in a way that is pretty seamless. That's that's going to start with culture. Doesn't change overnight, as we talked about, but I think this is really just essential. This is your starting point. We talked about shifting security information left and not the actual security workload. Third, just have the governance in place and guardrails to essentially allow everybody that's working on DevSecOps to do all of the right things, make it easy for that, but make it hard to do some of the wrong things. Look at the entire supply chain. Software supply chain is still relatively early, and how and certainly customers that I've spoken with, how they're thinking about it, how they're looking to to make some progress in putting these types of capabilities in place throughout their pipelines. And then continuous security. I think that's your end goal, and a big part of the way you can achieve it is through the use of automation and AI. So DevSecOps, not an easy problem or an easy achievement, but it's not impossible. And we talked about these 5 guiding principles, and surely there are more out there. I think it's important to share best practices. Culture, like I mentioned, is a major stumbling block in many cases, but it's not an insurmountable obstacle. And either with culture or with specific processes, you definitely want to iterate often, and then take a platform approach. That we talked about there being a lot of point solutions and a lot of individual technologies, but somehow it's got to come together in a way that fits and is easy to integrate, and certainly easier for all of the key stakeholders in a DevSecOps framework to use. So with that, that's the end of our program. I'd encourage you, check out what Harness has to offer in this space. One of our major solutions that we offer customers is how to deliver secure software. And so this is really based on 2 modules that we have. One is a security testing orchestration, and the other one is software supply chain assurance. These are both fully integrated into the Harness platform. And check out our website, harness.io, for more information as to what these modules and what our approach to secure software delivery can do for you. All right, that's the end of our program, but I'm going to hand it back to Cody briefly, and I think we're going to be able to take some questions here.
Yep, absolutely, Sean. And we've received quite a few questions, so thank you everyone for sending those in. Real quick, I would like to just give one more call out to the handout section. You will find a couple of resources there, including a link to the Harness website. So Sean, let's look at our first question. Varun asks you to clarify, what do we mean by developer control pipelines?
Developer control pipelines. Oh yes, so that was, I recall having that in one of my slides as a bullet. You want your developers to, and again, this is just sort of like some general context around that. Developers to be able to certainly to help themselves, like having some kind of self-serve model in place. You certainly don't want, in some cases, anybody to make any change that they want to the pipeline. And part of the control that you can offer developers would rely on some kind of fine-grained RBAC in some cases, and just making sure that if they are going to make certain changes, that's defined in their particular role. But I think it ultimately depends on how you operate as a software development organization, and like what your compliance policies are.
Awesome, thank you, Sean. Rolling right into our next question: how frequently should the RBAC need to be reviewed?
That is a great question. My particular recommendation, I think generally speaking, as your pipelines change, as your, I do think there are a lot of dependencies. Certainly, who is who's ultimately working on the application, across these functions. How is it change? Do you have specific goals that, let's say some metrics that you're not hitting, whether it's time to market, or do you need to give access to other stakeholders in a way that is going to improve your overall performance or your time to market? I think there are a lot of different dependencies, but that's ultimately up to your organization.
All right, so what proactive best practices or backup mechanisms do you recommend to stay on top of such attacks or vulnerabilities?
I'd say, we talked a bit about, and again, it depends on what types of attacks and what types of vulnerabilities. I think, there are new vulnerabilities being discovered each day, and it's important that, like, just have a, sort of like keep an eye out for some of the updates that are offered, that you can get on the top vulnerabilities out there. Update your scanners. Sometimes the scanners that you're using, you'll want to make sure that they're all up to date. I think it largely depends. Another recommendation, and you may be doing this already, but your developers should kind of be aware as much as possible, what new vulnerabilities there are, and if their approach to coding has an impact on that, then that kind of falls under the, can they train themselves up on some of the new secure coding methods that there are.
Awesome. Our next question asks, which tools can be used for vulnerability and security checks with editors?
With editors, I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure what you mean by editors. Could use a little clarification there.
All right. So if we do get that clarification, we'll bring it back up.
Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't answer that one off the bat.
Oh, no worries. We've got a question that asks if you've come across shift right, delta vulnerabilities, and runtime monitoring. I'm kind of combining two questions there.
Runtime monitoring. So shift right. I kind of interpret that to be sort of like, what are some of the security approaches for applications that that are running in production. That tends to be, there's an interesting distinction that, I think in most cases in the kind of build and deploy phases, there's a whole different focus to, how to make code more secure, how to secure your software artifacts. But then, when the application itself is running in production, you may be, going about security in an entirely different way. You could be, you've got some kind of, let's say, container security solution, or, I believe the category is CNAPP or CSPM. That involves, different tool set and different approach. And again, I don't have any good answers on that specifically. But again, just, it really highlights that, once you've, let's say you're running some of the best shift left security that you have, and you're really achieving kind of, a low rate of vulnerabilities in the code and the applications that you're building. I mean, the job's not over. Obviously, that there's the whole runtime phase and runtime environments that you have to secure.
Awesome. So it looks like we did get some clarification on that previous question. So which tools can be used for vulnerability and security checks, um, and can make security checks before committing code to repo?
Before committing code to repo. Not sure if you're looking for like examples of specific tools, or there should be, and again, this is something that we look at too, is that as you scan your code for vulnerabilities, and let's say you create a pull request, there should be, this sort of brings in, automated, brings in governance and sort of like automation in your process. But if you're going to pull code from a repo, then you definitely would want to initiate a scan at that point. That's something that we're looking at as well. I know that doesn't answer your question directly, but if you do look on our, we have a whole list of, there are about 40 open source and commercially available scanners in different classes. So your static application security scanners, software composition analysis, container scanners, secret scanners. And so, you can look on Harness's website on our STO page, and we'll list those out. But yeah, you can definitely integrate any of those into Harness STO and orchestrate those scans at a point where you're committing code to a repo.
All right, so we just keep getting questions in. So thank you everyone for sending these. Ikoye asks, who controls the pipelines, developers or the DevOps team?
I think in most cases, that would be sort of between your DevOps team and your security teams.
Colin asks, without reinventing the wheel for developer workflows, how do we implement this without increasing developer pain and having them adopt new tools?
Okay, yeah, there's quite a long answer to that. How do you, again, one of the trickiest parts of like, how do you make this whole secure software delivery framework work for developers? I do believe a really big part of that, we talked about security scans in your build pipelines, like being able to run those and do it early on enough where like what gets handed back to your developers is not only a prioritized and fully deduplicated list of the vulnerabilities that you find, but any kind of guidance that's available on how to remediate those. The developer is going to have to do some work to remediate a vulnerability within their code, but that's probably the best way is just to make it super simple and just make it effortless for them. I think getting a huge list and having them try to figure out what to focus on first if it's not prioritized, or they're trying to figure out, well, do I act on vulnerabilities from one scanner over another, or it, again, like you have to take the guesswork out of it. And if you can do it in a way that like you run scans early and feedback the information to them in a way that just makes it easier for them to go and remediate, where they're just not like completely cutting away from the work that you hired them for in the first place, but they can easily stay on top of it. Another thing too is just, and this is always tricky because it depends on the software that you're building, but can you over time reduce the number of vulnerabilities in your queue? I mean, you're going to run your pipelines and you may discover new vulnerabilities and have to deal with those, especially ones that are high priority. But over time, can you reduce the number of vulnerabilities in your queue? And I think that obviously will take a lot of workload away from your devs.
Does Harness work on not the internet? Sorry, I totally butchered the question there.
That's okay.
Will your product work in an environment that's not connected to the internet?
Oh, like an air gap environment?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe it will. We do have some customers that are just running, they're running the Harness platform on-prem.
Okay. Perfect. Sorry, we've got so many questions here. I'm just
No worries.
filtering through ones we've touched on. Could policy as code detect or avoid developer remove stages from pipelines like security stages?
You should be able to do that. If you can create the policy, then yeah, I don't think any developer should be able to make those kinds of changes to the pipeline. Or anyone for that matter. Again, it's entirely dependent on, what kind of DevOps platform are you running, and what's allowed and what's not. But generally, yeah, you would want to avoid, giving somebody and they may not do it purposefully. It may just, you kind of want to, like I said, put those guardrails in place. And if that's not the right thing to be done, or it requires approvals, and certainly the involvement of somebody in your security team in some cases, then yeah, you should be able to use OPA to prevent that.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and put this question up on the screen because it's kind of long, but by putting these security scanning mechanisms in place, at what point is the best approach? Fail the builds after the scan when the developer commits the code, or let the build pass and only block the merge once a peer review request has been reviewed and show the vulnerabilities to the reviewer? So it looks like we're given two options here.
Okay. Ultimately it depends, but I think, what I read from your question too is that, okay, what if there's an exemption or some kind of special circumstance where, like, you may not want to just completely block the build of an artifact when you discover a certain type of vulnerability, and maybe that vulnerability is like a false positive. Yeah, I think this is a great question, because it definitely highlights how, again, like you want developers and security people to be able to connect on this in the same platform. And so, yeah, if there's a question that comes up as to like what should happen, obviously there's the need to figure that out, or at least to have a game plan. But you should also be able to have that play out in the platform with some kind of, could you file a security exemption request as a developer? And then as a security practitioner, I would want to see what these requests are, and maybe I'm going to do some of my own investigation as to, what do we really need to do here? Is this a critical vulnerability that, or is it a false positive? Like, what is the right thing to do, within the process and within the, the organization itself. So I think, each of the options that you presented in the question, it would depend on, what type of vulnerability is, but at least there should be some kind of security exemption management workflow that you can use to figure that out.
All right, Sean, it looks like we have exhausted all of our questions. So as we do come up to the top of our hour, I wanted to ask you if you have any closing words or any words of wisdom to leave us with before we take this off the air.
Sure. No, thank you. And just a couple of quick points. I think this particular space is super interesting. There's been a lot of progress that I think it's always neat to see, what best practices sort of come up from people trying to figuring this out on behalf of their organizations. I hope you found the presentation valuable, or in some cases maybe the guidance here sort of confirms, or it's validation for some of the things that you're seeing success with as you try to build a DevSecOps program within your respective companies. I'd be really interested in connecting with folks. You can find me on LinkedIn, but one of the things I've observed too is that you have so many key stakeholders to make all of this happen. But I don't think I've ever seen, or rarely seen, anybody with a DevSecOps job title. I don't know companies that really have these formal, or formalized organizations or roles for DevSecOps. And I'm always interested to hear, how is this coming together internally? And is this a term that is even broadly used within the enterprise? I know everybody thinks about just building more secure software and building it faster, which is essentially the major objective here for why we do all these things within the DevSecOps framework. But I'm curious to know, how it's being talked about, and what are some of the things that you're finding effective in working across software development, IT operations, and security. So again, thank you so much for joining. Be interested to hear from you directly if you'd like to reach out. But thank you again.
All right, Sean, thank you so much for joining us today on Techstrong Learning. It's been such a pleasure hearing from you over the past hour. So a couple of final notes for our audience before I release you. A reminder that our session today was recorded and will be sent to you via email here as soon as we possibly can, but we'll also make sure that it is available for you shortly here on the DevOps website. That's devops.com/webinars. I'd like to thank everyone for their chats and their questions. And if you look in both the handouts as well as pinned to the top of the chat, you'll find a link to our post-webinar survey. If you fill that out for us, that will enter you for eligibility for our $50 Amazon gift card giveaway. So please do check that out, fill that out for us, and let us know your thoughts about our program today. I'd like to thank Harness for sponsoring today's session, and to everyone who is here in attendance. Thank you so much for participating and being here. You being here is really what makes these webinars worth it. And so we're appreciative, and we hope to see you at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, everyone, and you may now disconnect. Thanks again, Sean.
All right. Thank you.